Chapter 17 It was in the early fall of the following year that it happened. After his failure to get the Swift One, Red Eye had taken another wife. And strange to relate, she was still alive. Stranger still, they had a baby, several months old, Red Eye's first child. His previous wives had never lived long enough to bear him children. The year had gone well for all of us. The weather had been exceptionally mild and food plentiful. I remember especially the turnips of that year. The nut crop was also very heavy, and the wild plums were larger and sweeter than usual. In short, it was a golden year. And then it happened. It was in the early morning, and we were surprised in our caves. In the chill gray light we awoke from sleep, most of us, to encounter death. The Swift One and I were aroused by a pandemonium of screeching and gibbering. Our cave was the highest of all on the cliff, and we crept to the mouth and peered down. The open space was filled with the Fire People. Their cries and yells were added to the clamor, but they had order and plan, while we folk had none. Each one of us fought and acted for himself, and no one of us knew the extent of the calamity that was befalling us. By the time we got to stone throwing, the Fire People had massed thick at the base of the cliff. Our first volley must have mashed some heads, for when they swerved back from the cliff, 3 of their number were left upon the ground. These were struggling and floundering, and one was trying to crawl away. But we fixed them. By this time we males were roaring with rage, and we rained rocks upon the 3 men that were down. Several of the firemen returned to drag them into safety, but our rocks drove the rescuers back. The Fire People became enraged. Also, they became cautious. In spite of their angry yells, they kept at a distance and sent flights of arrows against us. This put an end to the rock throwing. By the time half a dozen of us had been killed and a score injured, the rest of us retreated inside our caves. I was not out of range in my lofty cave, but the distance was great enough to spoil effective shooting, and the Fire People did not waste many arrows on me. Furthermore, I was curious. I wanted to see. While the Swift One remained well inside the cave, trembling with fear and making low wailing sounds because I would not come in, I crouched at the entrance and watched. The fighting had now become intermittent. It was a sort of deadlock. We were in the caves, and the question with the Fire People was how to get us out. They did not dare come in after us, and in general we would not expose ourselves to their arrows. Occasionally, when one of them drew in close to the base of the cliff, one or another of the Folk would smash a rock down. In return, he would be transfixed by half a dozen arrows. This ruse worked well for some time, but finally the Folk no longer were inveigled into showing themselves. The deadlock was complete. Behind the Fire People, I could see the little wizened old hunter directing it all. They obeyed him and went here and there at his commands. Some of them went into the forest and returned with loads of dry wood, leaves and grass. All the Fire People drew in closer. While most of them stood by with bows and arrows, ready to shoot any of the Folk that exposed themselves, several of the firemen heaped the dry grass and wood at the mouths of the lower tier of caves. Out of these heaps they conjured the monster we feared, fire. At first wisps of smoke arose and curled up the cliff. Then I could see the red-tongued flames darting in and out through the wood like tiny snakes. The smoke grew thicker and thicker, at times shrouding the whole face of the cliff. But I was high up, and it did not bother me much, though it stung my eyes, and I rubbed them with my knuckles. Old Marrowbone was the first to be smoked out. A light fan of air drifted the smoke away at the time so that I saw clearly. He broke out through the smoke, stepping on a burning coal and screaming with the sudden hurt of it, and essayed to climb up the cliff. The arrows showered about him. He came to a pause on a ledge, clutching a knob of rock for support, gasping and sneezing and shaking his head. He swayed back and forth. The feathered ends of a dozen arrows were sticking out of him. He was an old man, and he did not want to die. He swayed wider and wider, his knees giving under him, and as he swayed he wailed most plaintively. His hand released its grip, and he lurched outward to the fall. His old bones must have been sadly broken. He groaned and strove feebly to rise, but a fireman rushed in upon him and brained him with a club. And as it happened with Marrowbone, So it happened with many of the Folk. Unable to endure the smoke suffocation, they rushed out to fall beneath the arrows. Some of the women and children remained in the caves to strangle to death, but the majority met death outside. When the Fire Men had in this fashion cleared the first tier of caves, they began making arrangements to duplicate the operation on the second tier of caves. It was while they were climbing up with their grass and wood that Red Eye, followed by his wife, with the baby holding to her tightly, made a successful flight up the cliff. The Fire Men must have concluded that in the interval between the smoking out operations we would remain in our caves, so that they were unprepared, and their arrows did not begin to fly till Red Eye and his wife were well up the wall. When he reached the top, he turned about and glared down at them, roaring and beating his chest. They arched their arrows at him, and though he was untouched, he fled on. I watched the third tier smoked out, and a fourth. A few of the Folk escaped up the cliff, but most of them were shot off the face of it as they strove to climb. I remember Long Lip. He got as far as my ledge, crying piteously, an arrow clear through his chest, the feathered shaft sticking out behind, the bonehead sticking out before, shot through the back as he climbed. He sank down on my ledge, bleeding profusely at the mouth. It was about this time that the upper tiers seemed to empty themselves spontaneously. Nearly all the Folk not yet smoked out stampeded up the cliff at the same time. This was the saving of many. The Fire People could not shoot arrows fast enough. They filled the air with arrows, and scores of the stricken Folk came tumbling down. But still there were a few who reached the top and got away. The impulse of flight was now stronger in me than curiosity. The arrows had ceased flying. The last of the Folk seemed gone, though there may have been a few still hiding in the upper caves. The Swift One and I started to make a scramble for the cliff top. At sight of us, a great cry went up from the Fire People. This was not caused by me, but by the Swift One. They were chattering excitedly and pointing her out to one another. They did not try to shoot her. Not an arrow was discharged. They began calling softly and coaxingly. I stopped and looked down. She was afraid and whimpered and urged me on. So we went up over the top and plunged into the trees. This event has often caused me to wonder and speculate. If she really were of their kind, she must have been lost from them at a time when she was too young to remember. Else would she not have been afraid of them? On the other hand, it may well have been that while she was their kind, she had never been lost from them, that she had been born in the wild forest far from their haunts. Her father may be a renegade fireman. Her mother may be one of my own kind, one of the Folk. But who shall say? These things are beyond me, and the Swift One knew no more about them than I did. We lived through a day of terror. Most of the survivors fled through the blueberry swamp and took refuge in the forest in that neighborhood. And all day hunting parties of the Fire People ranged the forest, killing us wherever they found us. It must have been a deliberately executed plan. Increasing beyond the limits of their own territory, they had decided on making a conquest of ours. Sorry for the conquest. We had no chance against them. It was slaughter, indiscriminate slaughter, for they spared none, killing old and young, effectively ridding the land of our presence. It was like the end of the world to us. We fled to the trees as a last refuge, only to be surrounded and killed, family by family. We saw much of this during that day, and besides, I wanted to see. The Swift One and I never remained long in one tree, and so escaped being surrounded. But there seemed no place to go. The Fire Men were everywhere, bent on their task of extermination. Every way we turned we encountered them, and because of this we saw much of their handiwork. I did not see what became of my mother, but I did see the Chatterer shot down out of the old home tree. And I am afraid that at the sight I did a bit of joyous teetering. Before I leave this portion of my narrative, I must tell of Red Eye. He was caught with his wife in a tree down by the blueberry swamp. The Swift One and I stopped long enough in our flight to see. The Fire Men were too intent upon their work to notice us, and furthermore, we were well screened by the thicket in which we crouched. Fully a score of the hunters were under the tree, discharging arrows into it. They always picked up their arrows when they fell back to earth. I could not see Red Eye, but I could hear him howling from somewhere in the tree. After a short interval his howling grew muffled. He must have crawled into a hollow in the trunk. But his wife did not win this shelter. An arrow brought her to the ground. She was severely hurt, for she made no effort to get away. She crouched in a sheltering way over her baby, which clung tightly to her, and made pleading signs and sounds to the firemen. They gathered about her and laughed at her, even as Lop Ear and I had laughed at the old Tree Man. And even as we had poked him with twigs and sticks, so did the firemen with Red Eye's wife. They poked her with the ends of their bows and prodded her in the ribs. But she was poor fun. She would not fight. Nor, for that matter, would she get angry. She continued to crouch over her baby and to plead. One of the firemen stepped close to her. In his hand was a club. She saw and understood, but she made only the pleading sounds until the blow fell. Red Eye, in the hollow of the trunk, was safe from their arrows. They stood together and debated for a while, then one of them climbed into the tree. What happened up there I could not tell, but I heard him yell and saw the excitement of those that remained beneath. After several minutes his body crashed down to the ground. He did not move. They looked at him and raised his head, but it fell back limply when they let go. Red Eye had accounted for himself. They were very angry. There was an opening into the trunk close to the ground. They gathered wood and grass and built a fire. The Swift One and I, our arms around each other, waited and watched in the thicket. Sometimes they threw upon the fire green branches with many leaves, whereupon the smoke became very thick. We saw them suddenly swerve back from the tree. They were not quick enough. Red Eye's flying body landed in the midst of them. He was in a frightful rage, smashing about with his long arms right and left. He pulled the face off of one of them, literally pulled it off with those gnarly fingers of his and those tremendous muscles. He bit another through the neck. The firemen fell back with wild, fierce yells, then rushed upon him. He managed to get hold of a club and began crushing heads like eggshells. He was too much for them, and they were compelled to fall back again. This was his chance, and he turned his back upon them and ran for it, still howling wrathfully. A few arrows sped after him, but he plunged into a thicket and was gone. The Swift One and I crept quietly away, only to run foul of another party of firemen. They chased us into the blueberry swamp, but we knew the tree paths across the farther morasses where they could not follow on the ground, and so we escaped. We came out on the other side into a narrow strip of forest that separated the blueberry swamp from the great swamp that extended westward. Here we met Lop Ear. How he had escaped I cannot imagine, unless he had not slept the preceding night at the caves. Here in the strip of forest we might have built tree shelters and settled down. But the Fire People were performing their work of extermination thoroughly. In the afternoon Hair Face and his wife fled out from among the trees to the east past us and were gone. They fled silently and swiftly, with alarm in their faces. In the direction from which they had come we heard the cries and yells of the hunters and the screeching of some one of the Folk. The Fire People had found their way across the swamp. The Swift One, Lop Ear, and I followed on the heels of Hair Face and his wife. When we came to the edge of the great swamp, we stopped. We did not know its paths. It was outside our territory, and it had always been avoided by the Folk. None had ever gone into it, at least to return. In our minds it represented mystery and fear, the terrible unknown. As I say, we stopped at the edge of it. We were afraid. The cries of the firemen were drawing nearer. We looked at one another. Hair Face ran out on the quaking morass and gained the firmer footing of a grass hummock a dozen yards away. His wife did not follow. She tried to, but shrank back from the treacherous surface and cowered down. The Swift One did not wait for me, nor did she pause till she had passed beyond Hair Face 100 yards and gained a much larger hummock. By the time Lop Ear and I had caught up with her, the firemen appeared among the trees. Hair Face's wife, driven by them into panic terror, dashed after us, but she ran blindly, without caution, and broke through the crust. We turned and watched, and saw them shoot her with arrows as she sank down in the mud. The arrows began falling about us. Hair Face had now joined us, and the four of us plunged on, we knew not whither, deeper and deeper into the swamp. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18. Of our wanderings in the great swamp, I have no clear knowledge. When I strive to remember, I have a riot of unrelated impressions and a loss of time value. I have no idea of how long we were in that vast everglade, but it must have been for weeks. My memories of what occurred invariably take the form of nightmare. For untold ages, oppressed by protean fear, I am aware of wandering, endlessly wandering through a dank and soggy wilderness, where poisonous snakes struck at us, and animals roared around us, and the mud quaked under us and sucked at our heels. I know that we were turned from our course countless times by streams and lakes and slimy seas. Then there were storms and risings of the water over great areas of the low-lying lands, and there were periods of hunger and misery when we were kept prisoners in the trees for days and days by these transient floods. Very strong upon me is one picture. Large trees are about us, and from their branches hang gray filaments of moss, while great creepers like monstrous serpents curl around the trunks and writhe in tangles through the air. And all about is the mud, soft mud that bubbles forth gases, and that heaves and sighs with internal agitations. And in the midst of all this are a dozen of us. We are lean and wretched, and our bones show through our tight-stretched skins. We do not sing and chatter and laugh. We play no pranks. For once our volatile and exuberant spirits are hopelessly subdued. We make plaintive, querulous noises, look at one another, and cluster close together. It is like the meeting of the handful of survivors after the day of the end of the world. This event is without connection with the other events in the swamp. How we ever managed to cross it I do not know, but at last we came out where a low range of hills ran down to the bank of the river. It was our river, emerging like ourselves from the great swamp. On the south bank, where the river had broken its way through the hills, we found many sandstone caves. Beyond, toward the west, the ocean boomed on the bar that lay across the river's mouth. And here, in the caves, we settled down in our abiding place by the sea. There were not many of us. From time to time, as the days went by, more of the folk appeared. They dragged themselves from the swamp singly and in twos and threes, more dead than alive, mere perambulating skeletons, until at last there were 30 of us. Then no more came from the swamp, and Red Eye was not among us. It was noticeable that no children had survived the frightful journey. I shall not tell in detail of the years we lived by the sea. It was not a happy abiding place. The air was raw and chill, and we suffered continually from coughing and colds. We could not survive in such an environment. True, we had children, but they had little hold on life and died early, while we died faster than new ones were born. Our number steadily diminished. Then the radical change in our diet was not good for us. We got few vegetables and fruits, and became fish-eaters. There were mussels and abalones and clams and rock oysters, and great ocean crabs that were thrown upon the beach in stormy weather. Also, we found several kinds of seaweed that were good to eat. But the change in diet caused us stomach troubles, and none of us ever waxed fat. We were all lean and dyspeptic-looking. It was in getting the big abalones that Lop Ear was lost. One of them closed upon his fingers at low tide, and then the flood tide came in and drowned him. We found his body the next day, and it was a lesson to us. Not another one of us was ever caught in the closing shell of an abalone. The Swift One and I managed to bring up one child, a boy. At least, we managed to bring him along for several years. But I am quite confident he could never have survived that terrible climate. And then, one day, the Fire People appeared again. They had come down the river, not on a catamaran, but in a rude dugout. There were 3 of them that paddled in it, and one of them was the little, wizened old hunter. They landed on our beach, and he limped across the sand and examined our caves. They went away in a few minutes, but the Swift One was badly scared. We were all frightened, but none of us to the extent that she was. She whimpered and cried and was restless all that night. In the morning she took the child in her arms, and by sharp cries, gestures, and example, started me on our second long flight. There were 8 of the Folk, all that was left of the horde, that remained behind in the caves. There was no hope for them. Without doubt, even if the Fire People did not return, they must soon have perished. It was a bad climate down there by the sea. The Folk were not constituted for the coast-dwelling life. We traveled south for days, skirting the great swamp, but never venturing into it. Once we broke back to the westward, crossing a range of mountains and coming down to the coast. But it was no place for us. There were no trees, only bleak headlands, a thundering surf, and strong winds that seemed never to cease from blowing. We turned back across the mountains, traveling east and south, until we came in touch with the great swamp again. Soon we gained the southern extremity of the swamp, and we continued our course south and east. It was a pleasant land. The air was warm, and we were again in the forest. Later on we crossed a low-lying range of hills, and found ourselves in an even better forest country. The farther we penetrated from the coast, the warmer we found it, and we went on and on until we came to a large river that seemed familiar to the Swift One. It was where she must have come from during the 4 years' absence from the horde. This river we crossed on logs, landing on side at the large bluff. High up on the bluff we found our new home most difficult of access, and quite hidden from any eye beneath. There is little more of my tale to tell. Here the Swift One and I lived and reared our family, and here my memories end. We never made another migration. I never dreamed beyond our high, inaccessible cave. And here must have been born the child that inherited the stuff of my dreams, that had molded into its being all the impressions of my life, or the life of Big Tooth, rather, who is my other self, and not my real self, but who is so real to me that often I am unable to tell what age I am living in. I often wonder about this line of descent. I, the modern, am incontestably a man. Yet I, Big Tooth, the primitive, am not a man. Somewhere, and by straight line of descent, these two parties to my dual personality were connected. Were the Folk, before the destruction, in the process of becoming men? And did I and mine carry through this process? On the other hand, may not some descendant of mine have gone into the Fire People and become one of them? I do not know. There is no way of learning. One thing is certain, and that is that Big Tooth did stamp into the cerebral constitution of one of his progeny all the impressions of his life, and stamp them in so indelibly that the hosts of intervening generations have failed to obliterate them. There is one other thing of which I must speak before I close. It is a dream that I dream often, and in point of time, the real event must have occurred during the period of my living in the high, inaccessible cave. I remember that I wandered far in the forest toward the east. There I came upon a tribe of Tree People. I crouched in a thicket and watched them at play. They were holding a laughing council, jumping up and down, and screeching rude choruses. Suddenly they hushed their noise and ceased their capering. They shrank down in fear, and quested anxiously about with their eyes for a way of retreat. Then Red Eye walked in among them. They cowered away from him. All were frightened, but he made no attempt to hurt them. He was one of them. At his heels, on stringy bended legs, supporting herself with knuckles to the ground on either side, walked an old female of the Tree People, his latest wife. He sat down in the midst of the circle. I can see him now as I write this, scowling, his eyes inflamed, as he peers about him at the circle of the Tree People. And as he peers, he crooks one monstrous leg, and with his gnarly toes scratches himself on the stomach. He is Red Eye, the atavism. This is the end of Before Adam by Jack London, recorded by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com.